When the UCP government of Jason Kenney was elected in 2019, one of the first things he did was reverse course on climate policy. And that has become a bit of a problem for investors, for instance, and for the corporate community. And Chris Severson-Baker of Pembina Institute has written an op-ed about why Alberta needs coherent climate policy. So we're going to talk to him about that. Welcome to the interview, Chris.
Hi, welcome. Thank you for having me.
Well, look, why don't we start with an overview of your op-ed, please?
Sure. So I think what we sort of lay out is this. The reality of the world is, as we sort of came out of Christmas this year, is that the world is moving on climate change. The Biden administration is making it a very high priority, and the rest of the world is already well down the track of sort of articulating how they intend to meet their carbon neutral by 2050 commitments. And so Alberta finds itself in a world where oil and gas is it's not going to be in demand in the same way that it was in the past, and there will be pressure on suppliers of energy to provide a low carbon energy product to the market. And so our case was that Alberta could help industry to attract investment into decarbonization by laying out its own commitment to achieving something akin to what the federal government has committed the rest of the country to, and a climate plan that actually lays out a roadmap for how that would be achieved.
Now, I've interviewed experts and I've interviewed economists about this issue, and everybody agrees that investors these days, financial institutions, want to know how corporations and jurisdictions are managing climate risk. So if a jurisdiction like Alberta doesn't have a coherent climate plan, then that's looked upon as a negative by investors and could affect access to capital. And I think, frankly, we're already seeing that in Alberta.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I think that investors are, especially of the fossil fuel sector, saying you need to demonstrate that you can be competitive in a low price environment and a low carbon environment, and then companies are seeking to make plans for how they would achieve low carbon operations in the future. And in order for them to be able to do that, they need to be able to anticipate what's happening with carbon policy in Alberta, and be able to convince their investors that if they were to make an investment in Alberta, that they would see a good return on their investment, that they can predict what's going to happen. And I think it's fair to say that up until quite recently, it's been very hard to convince investors that the climate policy is stable in Alberta. And even though we have a federal government who is laying out a roadmap to carbon neutral over time and is pledged to gradually increase the carbon price in a very consistent manner, there's some uncertainty about whether or not they'll be successful, whether or not there may be a change in government that would reverse that, and that kind of thing gets in the way of actually making those commitments to those big capital intensive investments.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I remember an interview 3 years ago for my book where I interviewed Harbir Chinna, who's the VP of Technology for Synovus. And they were supporters of carbon pricing. And he made a really interesting point. He said, look, give us a plan with an escalator on the carbon pricing, give us the longest runway possible so that we have the time we need to innovate and bring these two new technologies into production. And he said, we'll get our emissions down. But the worst thing you can do is give us a really short runway, or give us policy that lurches from this position to that position when we don't know, and we can't make reasonable investment decisions. And from what I'm looking at, this is kind of the worst case scenario. You had the Notley's climate leadership plan, then you've got another plan, and then if we have a different government, as you say, could have a third plan, and investors must be sitting there going, well, what's next? And that's not good for investment.
No, that's yeah, and I think we're hearing very strong pleas from the energy sector to just provide as much certainty as you possibly can at this stage, and because some companies are forecasting a carbon price, for their particular projects of around $300 a ton in 2030, if you add together the $170 carbon tax and credits that they can generate under the Clean Fuel Standard. But I mean, how bankable is that? You know, that's the real question. You know, you can do a lot of decarbonization projects if you know for sure that that's the price you're going to face. But if there's a lot of uncertainty, then you might not. You know, it'd be hard to convince an investor to look beyond, say, 2024 or 2025 in terms of what the carbon price might be at that level, and it might not be high enough yet to actually make the investment sound. And so I think it's incumbent upon the Alberta government at this point to sort of look at, well, what can it do to provide as much certainty and price stability as possible, because our industries really require a long runway, as you say, to secure that investment. And I think, you know, there's a risk that we won't see as much participation of the Alberta economy in that transition to carbon neutral as we otherwise would if we can't provide that certainty.
The final question, Chris. Joe Biden gets elected. He's, you know, we've seen over the last couple of months his really ambitious, you know, it's not just climate plan. This is the clean energy and clean tech revolution. I mean, he's talking about, you know, leapfrogging China by 2030. And it seems like everything in this, you know, in the clean energy, clean tech, and climate space has just accelerated in the last 3 months. Doesn't that put a lot more pressure on Alberta?
It has to be viewed as a huge wake-up call. I mean, the Americans are sort of like this, right? They'll sort of gather a lot of steam and seem to be doing nothing for a long time, and then they'll just leap way ahead of you. And so, you know, meanwhile, Canada, I think, has been sort of making steady but sort of slow progress on climate. And so in some areas we're doing quite well. You know, I think some of the work that has happened around methane emissions and other types of things have actually been really positive. But we have to pick up the pace if we want to stay competitive. If we want to actually, because there's going to be a lot of those dollars could be invested in the United States instead of in Canada, right? I mean, so we have to be very nimble, I think, in order to and really demonstrate, like really show up and sort of with a clear plan that for how the economy is going to unfold, so that companies can secure dollars from that investment community.
Actually, one final point, Chris. My impression, you know, living in Alberta and then covering Alberta for years and years, is that many people see climate policy as a stick. You know, you're being beaten to reduce you're trying to reduce the pain of carbon pricing or whatever it might be. And we don't look at it enough as an opportunity. I mean, there is tremendous opportunity in new technologies and clean tech around resource extraction and so on. And that's the part of the investment that we're going to be missing out if we don't have a coherent climate plan. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's a big question. I think, like, I mean, I think the way I'd answer it is Alberta has a ton going for it. And if we focus on what we might be losing, or if we focus on what we used to have and not focus on all the things that we have as assets, then we're really potentially going to miss the boat. You know, I think one way to look at it is, I mean, we benefited tremendously from decades of prosperity because of oil and gas. We spent that money in a variety of different ways. Some of it has resulted in really great infrastructure and lots of parks and good education, good healthcare, you know, very safe communities, all those types of things, you know, and so these are all assets that we don't spend a lot of time talking about in Alberta, but these are the kinds of things that make businesses pay attention and when they're thinking about where to site their next branch office. And I think that if we were to start to take a more whole scale sort of look at our assets, we would start to realize that we have more to offer than a lot of Albertans think. And you know, we're sort of like, there's always that risk of being too focused on one dominant industry. And I find that is still dominating our perspective as Albertans today.
Well, Chris, thank you very much for your insights. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.